I don't think one will be even able to experience or investigate all of these angles. I'm also not a linguist or somebody qualified to speak on all of the aspects of the implementation, but I would like to share one viewpoint with you this afternoon. And it's closely related to the language policy and plan. I want to take you back to the overall address by Professor Wim de Villiers on the 29th of April 2015. And in this inaugural address, he said, now there's an argument that we don't sufficiently meet the needs of those students who don't speak Afrikaans, and there are viewpoints to the contrary. So I think here he already highlights the issue of a variety of viewpoints on campus as to how the language policy and plan should be implemented. He also says, and this I'll come back to quite at the end, more to the end of the presentation, just want to highlight those two words. Language of instruction is a complex issue. So I'm going to get back to that in terms of language of instruction is a complex issue, because I completely concur with that. And it requires careful deliberation, and I would even add to that a careful listening to the lived experiences of the students and the staff members at Stellenbosch University, and a real understanding as to how it's implemented on campus. The policy says the university is committed to Afrikaans as academic language, but also to English, as well as the advancement of isiXhosa. And last but not least, and I'll get back to this as well, he said Stellenbosch is not an Afrikaans university, not an English university, not an isiXhosa university. Stellenbosch is a world-class multilingual South African university. So that is how he positions the language policy as well as the university itself. He also talks about language as not being a barrier to access, but a tool for success. And I think this is where it becomes particularly complex to actually achieve this, to not make language a barrier to access, but rather a tool to success. And this complexity has a variety of aspects. And I believe this afternoon, each one of us around this table, not just the four of us, but the audience as well, have pieces of the puzzle. But I don't even think we all in this room have all the pieces of the puzzle this afternoon. And therefore this conversation should continue as to how we make language not a barrier to access, but a tool to success. The next few slides are just going to give you some background. Memory already alluded to the language policy and what it aims to do. But I think a very important point that also links to my idea of conversation, a continuing conversation about the implementation of the language policy, is that 2014 wasn't a watershed. It wasn't as if something suddenly changed or happened. The evolutionary process already started in 2010, when we actually formulated a new language plan. As you know, the old language policy dated from 2002, but in 2010 there was a new language plan. And of course there were various forums, there were experimentation with interpreting services, with parallel medium, a variety of things. The revision process started in 2014, it was discussed at various forums, and of course now in 2015, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more as well, the implementation process of this new language policy and plan is starting. In terms of the consultation route, on the 23rd of June 2014, the Council requested the Vice-Rector Learning and Teaching to promote Stellenbosch University as a multilingual university, allude to the inclusivity aspiration, promote Afrikaans without exclusivity, but not to allow English to take over, to do language planning, and you can see the whole way of that played out. And by 29th of September, they expected feedback. The consultation group, there were discussions, staff and students, there was a priority bulletin that went out to staff and students, all staff and students, inviting comments to be submitted to talbelate@sun.ac.za, and there were also websites promoting the draft and new language policy. So it was advertised on News Area social media website, there was a forum article, And eventually the whole policy went through its route, the consultation route up to council. What is the language approach? We already alluded to that. I think it's very important to emphasize that we, as a university, we want to be multilingual in terms of the management of knowledge, engagement with knowledge. So again, getting back, we're not an Afrikaans university, we're not an English university, so it's not about the language or cultural asset, but rather we want to use language in terms of knowledge engagement. And in that sense, we want to give equal status to both Afrikaans and English, and isiXhosa where feasible. So that, in a nutshell, is what the new language approach is, according to the language policy. And in terms of isiXhosa, I just want to acknowledge the work done by the Language Centre already, by Kublani, by his colleagues in the Health Sciences faculty, as well as colleagues in the Education faculty, in the Theology faculty. And I've got some of the terminology guides, for instance, that they've been compiling, as well as course materials that they've been compiling in isiXhosa over the past few years. So it didn't happen, it started happening in 2015. This has been something that's been evolving over quite a number of years in terms of terminology lists, basic communication skills, as well as career-specific communication. We look at the Health Sciences faculty, how to be a doctor in English, isiXhosa, and in Afrikaans as well. So those are some of the things that are already happening in terms of isiXhosa. Then, of course, in terms of the place of Afrikaans, the Minister of Education, Mr. Ladies and Monday, on the 7th of November 2014, in Parliament, in answer to a question whether there's room for Afrikaans universities. Just the middle part there, he said that the department fully supports Afrikaans as a medium of tuition. However, it could be used in addition to another language like English, so that access is not denied to non-speakers of Afrikaans. And as an example, he actually said, for example, institutions like the University of Stellenbosch have progressively introduced English as an additional medium of tuition without compromising Afrikaans. This was on the 7th of the 11th, 7th of November. Of course, since then, we've not only progressively introduced English as an additional medium, but we've actually given it equal status to Afrikaans according to our new policy. Then very important, and this is becoming closer to the practical implementation, the complexity part that I really want to highlight this afternoon. Yes, we've got a policy, and the policy gives us guidelines. And we've got the equal status of Afrikaans and English, all the wonderful guidelines of the policy. That's the macro level language planning. That's what the university wants to be, a multilingual university. Then we've got the language plan. That tells us, okay, we can have interpreted services, we can have parallel reading. So that gives us the options of how we actually make this policy or put it into action. And then on the micro level, we've got the implementation within faculties, according to faculties' own plans, as well as the lecturers in the way they engage with the policy and plan. And I think this is where the complexity really hits us. Because what we often find is we can have a wonderful policy in terms of multilingualism, but in terms of the implementation, what actually happens in the classroom, there's often a gap. And I think these are some of the voices that we're currently hearing on campus, lived experiences of students saying, yes, this is all good and well, this is a wonderful policy, we know where the university is going, but this is not the reality in my class and where I'm sitting in my class. So I think that's something we seriously have to take note of. We've got to take that feedback on board, and we've got to work together to see how we're going to close this gap in terms of the implementation of the policy. And again, it's not as easy just to say, do this is the magic pill, this is the magic formula, if we all do this, then everything will be magically fixed, because I do think we deal with a very complex issue. And now I'm going to turn a little bit more as to what happens in the classroom. And I was struck last week, I was at a conversation at the Afrikaans and Netherlands department, and Professor Madiba from UCT actually said that what happens in the classroom is just the core of learning. in terms of teaching and learning, in terms of the pedagogy, in terms of what happens. What he argued was there's lots of other layers of the onion. And while I was sitting listening to him, I was reminded of this cartoon talking about teaching and learning. Okay, so if you can't read it, it says, I taught Spot how to whistle. I can't hear him whistling. I said I taught him. I didn't say he learned it. And in terms of language, in terms of usage, in terms of learning and teaching, yes, we've got the 40, 50-minute lecture in the class. But where does learning actually happen on this campus? Does it just happen in minutes? We actually had a think tank about a week ago where we thought about learning spaces of the future. And we asked, where do students learn, how do they learn, and when do they learn? Now, and we said, let's look in the crystal ball of 2024. And we found that even though we were looking in the crystal ball of 2024, we already found these shifts happening in terms of when students learn. On a continuum, of course. Yes, there's a physical classroom, there's also online. There's a large lecture, there's also smaller tutorials. Individual group, formal in-class, as well as more informal living spaces. So that 50 minutes in the class is possibly not the only place where students are learning. And this was the powerful point made by Professor Madiba last week as well, is that learning happens when the student walks out of that class and starts discussing with a fellow classmate in whichever language they're comfortable with. It happens in the small tutorial group. It happens in the residences, it happens in the learning spaces, the living spaces of the students. So I think maybe I'm making it more complex, but what I'm opening up the discussion for is if we're thinking about language as a medium of instruction and a medium to learn, one shouldn't just focus on that 50-minute period. Because as Professor Madiba said last week as well, UCT is a single language institution, English, but actually incredibly multilingual in terms of the learning that happens in all the spaces on campus. So really, I would love for us to continue this conversation. As I mentioned, we've got a policy. The policy provides direction, what the university wants to be, multilingual, excellent South African university. We've got a plan that provides a multitude of options. Now we are busy with the implementation, and here is where we've all got to take hands. The lecturers, the staff, the support services, the students. We've all got to listen to each other. So it's a process. It's not a on and off switch with a magical or a magic solution that we can just say, this is the magic pill, and if we do this, everything will be fine. Then, of course, lots of support by the Language Centre as well as institutional funding to support this multilingual model that we would like to have at the university. Thank you very much. That was my 15 minutes.
Thank you, Antoinette. I just want to, Antoinette has to leave at 10 to 1, so she's 7:32. So if she runs out, it's not because she's scared, it's because she has another meeting. Okay, Stefano, over to you.
I can think of two reasons why I've been asked to speak this afternoon. Unlike Antoinette, who has a professional interest in the matter of language and learning, Kies is published on the matter, Mo represents Africa, not Africa, but Stellenbosch, who have taken a public stand on language policy. I represent discipline, music, among whose many problems language does not feature significantly. So I reason I'm either here because my betters have proven themselves to be that by in their wisdom declining to speak, or because of this book, which I'm brought along to stand as my witness. As for the first reason, I've worked in Stellenbosch long enough to know the language debate devours young children. When one reads Peter Kapp's book, Maties in Afrikaans, it's immediately clear but the debate on the pros and cons of the language policy details are as little be settled as can the problems of South Africa. Regarding the second reason, all 3 volumes and 832 pages of it, if one publishes a research-based book of this scope in Afrikaans in 2014, one should not be coy about one's stand of Afrikaans as an academic language. So it's at the historical root of my decision to write in Afrikaans where I shall start. I love languages. At school, my mother was an English teacher, but who insisted she could only teach English second language to the Boer, literally the farmers of the district, arranged for weekly tutorial sessions in English for me. My mother was the most English person I've ever met up to that stage, but because of the Anglo-Boer War, which as far as I know, no one in our family participated in, she was again anti-English. English was a generic for the British Empire, for as far as I could see, we quite liked English people. She'd also been a student at Tuffy's when South Africa became a republic, and the afterglow of that event had never quite been erased from a sense of which is of who we are. Recently, when Rose fell at UCT, I got a call. "Ma," I said, "it's taken 100 years, but you must be delighted." She was not, predictably, because if there is one thing she hates more than English, it is change. So, relationship status with English, it's complicated. My mother instilled in me a love for English literature. At school I studied German, at university French. I only really started reading Afrikaans literature properly when I was studying abroad. When I returned, I wanted to learn isiXhosa. I tried twice, failed twice. My mind was no longer as agile as when I was 20. My time curtailed by family and career. I had to save the world in other ways, changing diapers, building up a pension. And so I returned to South Africa after completing my doctoral studies in Oxford to write a book about a forgotten Stellenbosch composer of forgotten music in a disciplinary wasteland in Afrikaans. It was a choice. Why did I do it? I shall answer by quoting from my book, one of the many English passages in the book, where the fictional biographer Werner Ansbach speaks about the importance of Afrikaans to his project while addressing an academic audience. And it's quite a lengthy quote, I quote. "In South Africa, Afrikaans academics have to negotiate the linguistic tightrope between Afrikaans and English with, in the best of views, a broadening of the perspectives on the work language can do. But let it also be said that it is a painful process, bifurcating between an honest desire for communication with a broader scholarly community, in which the lingua franca is English, and the flip side, fear of parochialism, and the desire to think and write and conduct verbal retrospection in the language of one's home, and therefore inevitably coupled with the politicized responsibility of Afrikaans academics to maintain Afrikaans as an academic language, and ultimately as a spoken language for future generations of South Africans. The responsibility I speak of is not a responsibility to a political idea, at least it is so no longer to me, but to all who might be driven out of themselves in future by finding the doors of the past locked in strange accents and unknown combinations of sounds. More controversially, I would claim it's to keep the options open of positioning oneself in a discursive space with the potential to stake out an authentic voice, a post-colonial South African position in a global discourse shaped by English, unquote. Like Werner Ansbach, I became convinced and remain so that in South Africa, English is a colonial language with a colonial cadence and an oftentimes parochial purview drip-fed in academia by domesticated theoretical vocabulary connected with generic ideas severed from words as organisms and languages as ecosystems of meanings. I write in Afrikaans because I believe it is a radical thing to do. I encourage my students to do so, in addition to writing in English. because I believe it will make them more radical writers and thinkers. Working from the margins on the seam between languages is a highly uncomfortable thing to do, and therefore exactly right as an intellectual position that eschews complacency. Precisely because words like apartheid, dompas, baas, kleerling, kaffer resonate so grotesquely in Afrikaans, the language demands vigilance and care, formal concessions to deep moral transgressions, constant attention to remaking. Afrikaans trembles with the closeness to our shared history. This is why Afrikaans belongs as a language of instruction and research in our institutions of higher learning, not out of fear for its demise, but in recognition of its entire paradigm of South African experience. I've read the Open Stellenbosch Memorandum of Demands of 13 May 2015, particularly the section on the language policy, and I agree with much of what is written there. The condemnation of the discourse of vulnerability is applied to Afrikaans, the concomitant adoption of a defensive rhetoric by the university, the apartheid nostalgia that is recognized in referencing a history that seems to be more important than the present or future, the structural failure to see and engage with Afrikaans as a site of cultural production, often reactionary cultural production, the politically naive institutional dismissal of whiteness as an enduring and shaping power in our land, as Stellenbosch, the way in which Afrikaans is symbolically and functionally woven into systemic and structural manifestations of racism and segregation, by making it into a normative code, the assertion that at Stellenbosch the language issue is the mechanism through which systemic segregation functions. In all of these areas, I think Open Stellenbosch has advanced readings that deserve to be taken seriously, debated, and addressed. What I don't read in this memorandum is an attempt to balance the above with an equally incisive reading of the intellectual and theoretical advantages of multilingualism in teaching and research, or even to acknowledge that multilingualism constitutes a reasonable point of departure for the university in our country. I find it disconcerting that Afrikaans is not seen as a language of access for the majority of its speakers who are not white, and is therefore not insisted upon as a priority language of teaching at the university in that very capacity. I find the memorandum curiously silent about language diversity, as if we all ultimately aspire to the articulated bliss of English prose. For a document as aware of ideology, power, and historical injustice as this memorandum is, it seems intentionally oblivious to the layeredness of the affiliations, complicities, burdens, networks, roots, and lives of Afrikaans and its entanglements with the people in and of Stellenbosch and the broader South Africa. It also feigns ignorance of the history of language tolerance and the decades of progressive accommodation of English on campus, implemented by successive management teams under severe pressure from language activists intent on preventing such compromises, something that Kies, for one, has written about. Be that as it may, Open Stellenbosch has enlivened our campus life by problematizing student co-option, indefinite long-termism as a palliative for delayed action, good manners as a desirable intellectual attribute, protest action as lawless, thinking as regimented, policy as action, racist incidents as exceptional events, acquiescence as legitimation of power. And there is much to admire in this achievement, not least its courage and strategic acuity. So, having stated why I feel Afrikaans is important to an institution like Stellenbosch, I must also say, perhaps but not necessarily in contradiction, that given the context of the perilous state of our country at this time and the need to act boldly, the case to adopt a language policy that prioritizes optimal inclusion at all our universities is overwhelming. Not because I embrace English homogeneity in undergraduate teaching or postgraduate or advanced research as a radical progressive strategy, on the contrary. I will continue to resist it in my thinking, my teaching, my reading, my writing. Not because I think it won't harm Afrikaans or Afrikaans speakers if the majority are not white. On the contrary, I think it will damage the language and disadvantage its speakers, especially its most vulnerable speakers. And not because I believe the use of English as a language of instruction will make white power yield. On the contrary, it will channel it into more subtle conflicts and forms. Where the optimal inclusion of all South Africans at Stellenbosch University can be achieved by legislating English homogeneity, making it part of a policy, is in my opinion highly unlikely. But I think what we are seeing unfold across the campuses in our country shows that our time for more elegant solutions to complex problems has started to run out. That our country is bleeding, struggling to right itself after the disaster of apartheid and its aftershocks, that if Afrikaans is to flourish, it will have to be in concert with or in the mouths of the intelligent voices of those who are currently protesting against the way it lives in our institution. How this has to be achieved has perhaps less to do with policy than with the recognition that at this time we need to act with some sense of common purpose to secure our future in South Africa, and that the time for language debates have come and gone, that priorities have become more brutally existential, and that we should urgently prioritize the country's needs in terms of this stark reality.
Thank you, Stefan. Mohammed is next in line.
Thanks very much. I think I should preface my remarks by saying that multilingualism is a great thing, and I think in principle we're all in support of it. But multilingualism has to start on a clean slate. And I think that, you know, what I seem to be hearing from the fellow panelists, as well as conversations around campus and also nationally, is that somehow we can jump to multilingualism and therefore transcend our historical interpolation. I don't think that's correct at all, because no right-thinking person can deny that Stellenbosch is a space of deeply entrenched and institutional racism and patriarchy, and that's a historical thing. And the language question can't be separated from the question of ethics, and ethics cannot be conceived of outside of the processes of developing democratic intuitions. And so when we're talking about the language issue, we should be driven by a will to social justice and be thinking about ways of working together to bring about critical change at Stellenbosch University, and a change that can only be realized by addressing the language question as something that does not exist ex nihilo, but is something that is that has its roots historically. And I haven't heard any of that coming from the defenders of the language policy. And so, Open Stellenbosch particularly, and I speak on behalf of myself, but also on behalf of the movement, recognizes our location in the belly of the beast of neo-apartheid infrastructure in the Marxist sense. And I want to also begin by highlighting an obvious fact that the post-apartheid present is mediated by historical discourse, as I said, but the language itself, language capital L, is the bearer of discourse. And that if language is the bearer of discourse, it is therefore central to ideology. And I also don't hear that coming out from any of the defenders of the language policy or the use of language as a medium of instruction. Language, both as a means of communication as well as a process of meaning making, can be used and has been used or manipulated to subjugate black people in general. The typical conception of collective and individual power dynamics, a way of understanding one's existence as arising ex nihilo, creates a false history which further implies that cultures and people at different places on the timeline, when in truth they are merely different. And hence I want to suggest that we commit ourselves to unlearning the naturalized and commonsensical ways of accounting for disenfranchised groups. And to this extent, I want to suggest that we refute notions of diversity and inclusivity in favor of comprehensive transformation, and by the way, multilingualism also falls within that category. In favor of comprehensive transformation of the space, since the conception of inclusivity, diversity, multilingualism relegates Black people to mere appendages of a white, specifically Afrikaner, dominant culture and mode of being. And I'll explain this further as it relates to language. The idea of diversity of languages, of peoples, of class, of various subject formations belongs to the terrain of cultural studies within which the discourse of minorities is located. The language policy, the discourse about diversity to which it gestures, may in fact be complicit with the minoritization of cultures and people in Stellenbosch University. And if we are, for instance, to rethink some of the early formulations in post-colonial subject formation, some of the early ideas proposed by scholars and thinkers such as Ravi Baba, for instance, I would suggest that we relocate culture within the diversifying process and therefore highlight the benefit of historicizing the discursive construction of social reality, which is in turn reified in the language policy. And the idea that such an historicism is only possible if one relocates the referential and institutional demands of such a theoretical work in the field of cultural difference is important, because we cannot get to that by looking at cultural diversity. And so I'm making the distinction here between difference and diversity, and I'm suggesting that we take seriously the question of difference before we jump to diversity and multilingualism, etc. And it's important for my undertaking because cultural diversity is concerned with epistemological objects, and it is therefore constituted by treating culture or language as an object of empirical knowledge. And so the usefulness of difference within cultural studies, the usefulness of difference within the question of the language policy is that difference, cultural difference in fact, lies in the very idea that the enunciation of cultural difference, it problematizes the binary division of past and present, and so forth, and therefore disrupts the very homogenizing symbols that one will find in notions of cultural diversity. The idea of a fixed and single community or a stable system of reference. And when we take the language policy as a point of departure to questions of transformation, we are fighting for substantive and comprehensive transformation, which is attuned to the lives of Black people, a political term which for us is not only a matter of pigmentation, but also includes those people who have a shared experience of discrimination and dehumanization. And this links to the question, the issue that was raised earlier about the memorandum not being attentive to the number of Black people who do speak Afrikaans. And what we want to do then is challenge the privileging of Afrikaans as a medium of instructions, not simply on the grounds that it is necessary if we are to bear the full fruit of inclusivity, but on the grounds that it belies the university's own vision statement. And in addition to that, we want to suggest that because the university is largely funded by a post-apartheid democratic South African state, it means that it is inherently a public space. And it follows that such a space should be one to which all students should feel able to lay equal claim. And we haven't even gotten to the ways in which language precludes, in fact, Black people from compliance. So we're just dealing here with people that are here already. And I'm talking about access not simply student-related, but also as it relates to the very shameful statistics in terms of the staff demographics here so much. And we're going to how the privileging of Afrikaans as a medium of instruction translates itself into the privileging beyond the classroom. It extends into the social fabric of our residences and other spaces where Black people are constantly marginalized and maligned. And management's response to our movement thus far has been predictable. Defend Afrikaans as the language of instruction by insisting on multilingualism and repeating that the use of Afrikaans as a primary medium of instruction is constitutionally valid and protected. Ironically, the University Council, the Vice-Chancellor, the Vice-Rector, who are supposedly the key overseers of transformation, because at the end of the day that's what we're talking about, transformation, have failed to recognize that the achievement of equality is one of the founding values of the Constitution. The right to equality is entrenched in Section 9 of the Constitution, and this right is elaborated on in the Promotion of the Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act, PREVENT. I want to note that the problem with the university's current approach to transformation has to do with a deliberate equivocation of key terminology, a convenient mistake on the part of management. For instance, the uncritical understanding of race is taken to mean different things at different times, or race is taken to mean different things at different times. This equivocation works well for those who do not recognize the need to account for the injustices of the past. And such people will often claim that any differentiation on the basis of race should be deemed racist. And related to that, what is also often conflated is the distinction between direct and indirect discrimination. Indirect discrimination can and often does amount to unfair discrimination. And indirect discrimination, as exemplified by the language policy, or is epitomized by the language policy, or is enabled by the language policy, includes any discrimination which is framed in terms of ostensibly neutral criteria, but one that nonetheless has the effect of marginalizing a particular group. In a landmark case on indirect discrimination in the Constitutional Court, the decision in the City Council of Pretoria versus Walker, this idea was properly summed up by Lana GP in noting that the problem with cases of indirect discrimination is that there is almost always some purpose other than a discriminatory purpose involved in the conduct or action to which objection is taken. And as far as Stellenbosch University is concerned, that purpose is said to be the protection of Afrikaans, or the protection of the language rights of the Afrikaans minority. And so the calculated actions of the university amount to a protection not of Afrikaans culture, but of white Afrikaans culture in particular. And so staff demographics are not the most striking and measurable indication of this. The staff demographics are the most striking and measurable indication of this, but they are by no means the only indication of the ways in which such a re-argued move, in fact, protects not only Afrikaans culture, but specifically white Afrikaans culture. And I think that's something that we cannot, this conversation cannot run away from. And from its inception, Open Stellenbosch, for instance, has impressed upon the student body the single message that we want to listen to their stories, the qualitative stuff that you were talking about, the lived experience. Well, here's one. I remember sitting in a lecture once when a student raised her hand to clarify something with the lecturer. So begins one of the hundreds of stories that have been sent to Open Stellenbosch. What the students describes next is a several minute long monologue in which the student was personally attacked for having dared to ask the question, "You people come to our university and expect us to change." The stories that are the most revealing are often the most subtle ones. And one student recalls, for instance, the way his lecturer, while following the language policy, would nonetheless make all of his jokes in Afrikaans. And jokes told in this way are not funny. They are a sign of the systemic exclusion of black students, and through that exclusion, a way of securing white Afrikaans culture, which was founded and since kept in place through symbolic, systemic, and physical violence in the present. And so, I want to talk about, very briefly, the ways in which the language policy at Stellenbosch University functions to position Afrikaans as subject to vulnerability. And the language policy therefore presenting itself or suggesting that it is the duty of the language policy to protect Afrikaans not only as a means of communication but also as a site of cultural production. And it's for this reason that we need to interrogate the rhetoric of the language policy in order to trace in it the apartheid nostalgia that undergirds its very existence. It states in its aims and overview that it is first and foremost committed to the use, the safeguarding and sustained development of Afrikaans as an academic language in a multilingual context, and I've spoken briefly about the problems associated to that. But that this function runs in tandem with the aim to increase teachings teaching offerings in English. And in addition, the policy acknowledges that, quote, language diversity promotes accessibility for staff and students. However, the application of this is done only through a pragmatic approach, which takes into account the resources for support mechanisms, etc. And so, while we are persuaded to believe that multilingualism or language diversity is what the language policy is about, the giveaway, of course, lies in the defensive rhetoric that seeks to preserve a certain sense of power, which is predicated on white privilege and cultural hegemony. And I don't think it's something, again, that has been addressed or that is spoken about by defenders and advocates of the current language policy. Not to mention, of course, the idea that isiXhosa is used, in fact, as a front for multilingualism at the university. Very recently, on Sunday evening, hard at work, the PR and spin doctors of the university released a statement through News 24 suggesting that the university had committed 150,000 rand to the development of isiXhosa as an academic language. In that very same article, the headline says SU promotes isiXhosa, but and that's 150,000 rand dedicated to isiXhosa. In that same article, 150,000 rand is also revealed to be dedicated to Afrikaans. And so you wonder then what the situation is. Why then are you suggesting or posing or window dressing or glamorizing? Is the university insisting on that kind of a headline because it wants us to somehow congratulate it? We cannot overlook the fact that on the one hand, Xhosa is used as a front for multilingualism at this university, and that's something that we can deal with. We can discuss that. But on the other hand, and I think this is something that we cannot accept, is when the Xhosa language itself is taken and used to promote Afrikaans directly. And I want to end with a quote taken from the rector of the University of Free State. Adam Habib said a similar thing as well in his inauguration, as does Cesar Walizela of Rhodes University. Some of the historically white Afrikaans universities have a perfect alibi for not transforming Afrikaans. When the Potchefstroom campus of Northwest University or the University of Stellenbosch is pushed to enroll more black students, they take refuge in language rights protected by the Constitution. Somebody must tell these campus leaders that in the wake of our horrific past that again is seldom glossed over, is often glossed over, in the context of our horrific past, white-dominant campuses in this country are morally unacceptable, demographically unjust, and educationally dangerous. Afrikaans as a language is vital to our multilingual democracy and must be expanded, but as the handmaiden of social justice, not racial exclusion. And so I'd really like to hear, coming out of the advocates and defenders of the language policy, issues related to transformation and race as it is influenced by the language policy.
Thank you, Ron.
Thanks very much. Dominic, I make an argument for analytically separating the context of languages for social identification and languages for education at Stellenbosch University. This relates to the distinction between the value of isolation versus relation. For making progress with the language policy that is out of sync with the needs of students, we need to understand the symbolic role of Afrikaans, why English is becoming the primary language for undergraduate instruction, and the implications this has for the language plan that is just. Afrikaans is a symbol of whiteness in the context of social identification. Seen as a socio-linguistic process, the Afrikaans language struggle correlated with the terms of the nationalist movement. At the same time, white Afrikaans speakers generally have an excellent understanding of English, but the Afrikaner ideology of exclusivity still has some traction and requires a strong boundary in the index of languages, especially with regard to English. This has to be understood in the historical and current context of a combination of inequality with separateness in South Africa. The potential for mobilization around Afrikaans as the core symbol of being white Afrikaners remains high, and pressures from some members of the council and convocation to refashion Stellenbosch into a mainly Afrikaans university can be expected to continue. We don't seem to escape the politics of race and ethnicity easily. In the past, Afrikaans flourished in a context where it was on par with English, the other official language before democracy. Note, however, that the standard of Afrikaans was based on the dialect of its white speakers and purposely developed away from its Creole origin in line with the ideology of racial purity. Education, government, bureaucracy, Bible translation, and the media were core instruments for fixing the standard. Attempts to make the taal stick forcefully to the black population failed, and they have mostly identified with English as the language of liberation and education. Similarly, growing numbers of Afrikaans speakers opt for English as the language of education, commerce, and internationalization. Post-1994, the official status of Afrikaans was made equal to the other official languages, and its declining role was influenced by its black and young white speakers who have a less conservative relationship to the language. In the transformation of tertiary education, the need of black students for access to the top universities in the country has put pressure on the formerly Afrikaans language university, resulting in parallel classes and translation services. The result has been a stronger place of English in the educational programs. The shift in language use, while based on practical considerations, has often been met with ideological resistance in the form of language struggles. In line with the symbolic role of Afrikaans in Afrikaner nationalism, this university was created in 1980 to promote a distinct Afrikaans academic institution as part of the white politics of South African bilingualism. While English had a minor place in teaching from the beginning, there were sufficient numbers of students and academics to keep this elite institution going in Afrikaans for nearly a century. This situation changed dramatically with the massification of higher education, the opening of universities to all, and the resultant demographic changes. The proportion of Afrikaans-speaking white students became smaller, a number of black Afrikaans speakers arrived, but more dramatic was the increased entry of English-speaking whites and black students who were ready to study in English. At the moment, the tipping point has been reached, with about 50% of the students being Afrikaans-speaking. The university has repositioned itself from being a Volksuniversiteit to become a South African and international institution. But many still regard the university in terms of its exclusive role for the benefit of Afrikaans-speaking whites. In 2000, the university committed itself to serve all who want to study here, and since then a series of controversies developed around the language policy. It is interesting to observe that policy followed changes in demography. In 2002, the policy line was to promote Afrikaans but allow some English by means of parallel and double medium courses or the occasional English course. The convocation and its supporters reacted with angry attacks on the management of the university for not strengthening the position of Afrikaans. In the meantime, demographic changes continued, and it became generally accepted that postgraduate and research work was done mainly in English. More space was made for English and dual medium teaching, but at the same time, the language activists were pacified by management that made unsustainable promises about keeping courses in Afrikaans at 60%. A discrepancy developed between the policy and practice of teaching. The promise of protecting Afrikaans played to the core by conservative whites for keeping the Afrikaans and white tradition in place, while simultaneously the university was attracting black students with promises of English. As a result of the demographic change, the use of English grew in most faculties, but in a way that was not publicly celebrated. In some faculties, there were attempts to retain teaching in Afrikaans only. It is no surprise that black students felt alienated by this contradiction between a dominant ideology of protecting Afrikaans and the reluctant and faltering practice of multilingualism. By the end of 2014, the most recent attempt at handling at this juncture between the ideal of preserving Afrikaans and the reality of the increasing use of English arrived in the form of the current language policy. Now, Afrikaans is no longer marked as a default language, but the emphasis is on making both Afrikaans and English available to students by means of technical arrangements, and at the same time continuing the commitment to the protection and promotion of Afrikaans. It is remarkable that the language policy refers to the availability of black Afrikaans speakers to make an argument for the sustainability of Afrikaans, but does not address the need to make Afrikaans more inclusive of its Kaaps and other marginalized varieties. In order to implement the new language policy of 2014, parallel classes and interpretation services are now offered. While this change away from Afrikaans as a default language reflects the need to accommodate a growing number of black students, the parallel classes and interpretation services will probably not last very long. White Afrikaans-speaking students will mostly vote with their feet and join the English classes, something which is to be welcomed for the social inclusivity that will be achieved, while this contributes to the decrease of Afrikaans at the academic level. Interpretation to Afrikaans will similarly not be in high demand due to the excellent knowledge of English that many Afrikaans speakers have. Translation of a lecture can never compete with the quality of direct interaction. Few lecturers will be willing to continue teaching in Afrikaans to growing numbers of students that are non-Afrikaans speaking. Where courses are still offered only in Afrikaans, this is clearly clashing with the Constitution's emphasis on non-discrimination, as this practice excludes students who do not have a basic knowledge of Afrikaans. In this situation of fluidity and contestation, it can be expected on the basis of the past that some of the alumni of the university will react strongly against further increases in English medium teaching. The challenge is to achieve inclusivity and linguistic diversity at the same time. When thinking of the changes that are now needed in undergraduate teaching, there is no possibility of returning to Afrikaans as the default language. That position would take the university back to the collective identification with the taal as the core symbol of Afrikaans whiteness. The present official position of multilingualism is a step in the right direction, and this has to be synchronized with the need for access for all who want to study at the university and for whom English is the only medium. At the same time, many of these students may need much more help with the acquisition of academic English than they are getting at the moment. Yet access through English as lingua franca needs to be prioritized above multilingualism in its present form. Further reasons for the choice for English as the main language of teaching is the context of internationalization, the context of work, and the need to hire academics from across the world. The Open Stellenbosch Manifesto asks for a more just provision of tuition in English for students without an Afrikaans background. In other words, an end to educational exclusion through Afrikaans. The university can use this opportunity to move beyond that demand towards a really inclusive language policy that takes English as the default option. At the same time, the university should implement its commitment to multilingualism by means of a strong support program for students and staff in English, Afrikaans, and isiXhosa. This would follow from changing from the use of Afrikaans for identity purposes to the use of Afrikaans for educational purposes. The university has excellent resources that can be used for providing tutorials, terminologies, multilingual assessments, translation services, and for supporting publications in Afrikaans and isiXhosa. Parallel to this support in the language of the student, there is a strong need for upgrading the skills of all our students to a more sophisticated level of academic English. The multilingual approach can facilitate the improvement of the skills in English, as this takes place on a conceptual level, where the first language of the student is of great importance. Academic support and multilingualism need massive resources and should be expanded. The process of developing the language policy will need the combined intellectual resources of the university as a whole. Management, Senate, Council, staff, and students should all have a role to play. It is crucially important to understand the subjective reality of Afrikaans as an identity market, most importantly for its white speakers, but also its more practical importance for Black Afrikaans speakers. Some students who have been less exposed to English will need linguistic bridging. Therefore, the value of Afrikaans and isiXhosa in facilitating learning on the undergraduate level needs to be taken seriously. I realize that the move from Afrikaans to multilingualism and from multilingualism to English as a focus in the language policy requires a lot of adjustment from Afrikaans speakers who feel they are required to give up a core symbol. This reminds one of the considerations whites had to make in the early 1990s around giving up exclusive control of the country. It is a matter of calculating loss and gain. In order to move forward in the emerging debate, I offer some moral and practical arguments. As in the 1990s, the interests of white and Black Afrikaans speakers are entangled with the interests of all the people in the country. Stellenbosch University cannot be considered separately from the needs of the Black students who are coming here for quality education. We are all related as citizens of one country and committed to the development of all its people and beyond. Commitment to democracy and justice should be translated into the provision of opportunities for all. The university has a special contribution to make in this regard and can do this best through commitment to English as a lingua franca and through multilingualism. Similarly, the role of language in nationalism, racism, and underdevelopment has to be recognized and addressed. The university cannot be a white or a Black space, but should be a truly South African space, where the emphasis is on openness and interaction, where we are all minoritarian to some extent, and where we seek to embrace the other in a critical embrace. A balance between inclusivity through the use of a lingua franca and diversity through the use of vernaculars needs to be found. We need a public ethic that moves away from the search for separate identities to a search for relationship. The implication is that we should not continue to pursue identity, culture, and language in isolation from the realities of poverty and inequality. Injustice with regard to access to good education is morally unjustifiable. Putting oneself in the shoes of the Black students helps to understand their anger at experiencing alienation. Afrikaans universities were not sustainable due to democratization. Similarly, efforts to retain Afrikaans in a special position are not sustainable. This follows from the choice made by white and Black Afrikaans-speaking students for proficiency in English. Language change is a continuous social fact and provides new opportunities. The value of multilingualism lies in the dynamic relationships that appear when it is honest and practical. Its full potential is realized when we all learn at least one new language. This is what Caribbean philosopher and poet Edouard Glissant meant when he characterized colonization as a relation. The promotion of Afrikaans in schools, in literature, media, and arts, in language support for Afrikaans-speaking students, and in Afrikaans scientific publications is in line with the current realism of a repositioned status of Afrikaans. It is a field where much further work has to be done. The experience gained in this work should be used to promote African languages following the vision of the late Neil Alexander.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you all for speakers for very insightful and elegant presentations. really is a complex issue, and it seems that the speakers all can comfortably adhere to the whole principle of multilingualism, but there are very substantial, often subtle differences as to how to get there. So I want to open the discussion to members of the audience. I want to ask people not to make long speeches, but to make succinct points, jokes, questions, remarks, and so on.
Hi, thank you to the panelists. I'm Jacob Sokona. I study in 2010. I work at CPT now in the Transformation Office. I'm here mainly in support of inclusivity at this university. My question to the management of this university is, are they aware that Stellenbosch, according to the higher education transformation units, is the least transformed university in the country? And along with Northwest University, the Polish university, have got deep instances of rooted institutional racism. Yeah, it's just totally unacceptable that the university still travels 21 years in the office.
Thank you. Would you like the panel members to respond to that? Or the panel members?
Yeah, I think it's transformation is a complex issue. And I'm not here on behalf of the university management to defend any positions on transformation currently. I know that the university is very serious about transformation. If you see what Professor de Beer said in his inauguration speech about moving forward, acknowledging the past and saying, again, not starting with a clean slate, to say that we're starting with a clean slate, but acknowledging the past. And the previous management of the universities have done so at numerous occasions, and he's done so in his inauguration speech as well. So I think there's a real commitment from management to move forward, to move to the future in terms of transformation. Any of the other panel members wanting to speak about the speed of transformation?
But maybe I can just say I of course don't speak for the university as well, I'm not in the management. But there is, there should be a deep concern. A colleague of mine, Joe Berg, came here recently to a series of discussions and looked around and said that, are there no black academics at Stellenbosch University? And after 3 days of discussions, it was clear that even though divergent viewpoints in these discussions were being raised, we were speaking from a paradigm that was remarkably similar. If the composition of the bodies in the room doesn't change, the conversation remains essentially the same conversation. And there is no doubt that language has something to do with it. How exactly that fit works, I think that is very complicated. But I also sense that there is an impatience now with saying this is a long-term thing and will have to work itself out. That can't be said indefinitely.
Yeah, I think this is again, I'll keep saying this until the cows come home. I'm against inclusivity completely, and this is what the university is advancing and promoting, this idea of inclusivity. And I think when we really look into it, it's a very ugly story, because first of all, it takes as the normative code the status quo, white, heterosexual, male, to which every other subcategory, different entity to be included needs to be needs to adhere, or a space needs to be to to be created by that. If the university is serious about transformation, I would strongly suggest that it drops the vocabulary of inclusivity completely. Drop that out of your vocabulary and speak about transformation, not as a dirty word, but as a necessary condition for the success and excellence of Stellenbosch. And so, 21 years after the university has been able to fly under the radar using the language policy as an alibi for anti-transformation. You see, when they say inclusivity, they don't actually have to say what the real oil behind the machine is, which is anti-transformation. I really think that, and that's a strong claim, and I make that with absolute courage and my conviction. The university is anti-transformation until it begins to drop the word inclusivity and to rethink and critically problematize its understanding of diversity and what that means.
Thank you. Here's a question.
I think I just want to remark something about the violence of the space. And because when we were on our way here and Rose and just sequencing this presentation, I was saying that this is not a combative space for, it's a space for reflection, critical reflection. And then when we arrived and Rose came and sat in the front of the panel, I'm actually feeling like I'm going to get a heart attack. I'm saying this right now. So it's something to do with the kind of violence of the space that we're in. And I really feel the need to mark that because when we came in and Rose was not introduced as a panel, was actually introduced as a panel of 3 white speakers in the department. And these are my colleagues and organize the event and important work that you're doing. But I do feel that I have to say this. And then, eventually Rose was introduced. And then when Stefan started speaking and referenced Rose as a representative of Africa, I just found myself extremely discomforted. And then I also wanted to talk about the composition of the panel and to say, like it is disturbing that there are not Black academics here who can speak, and that Mo, who is actually a PhD candidate and who has just started his PhD, has stepped up in his way to speak on the topic of Stellenbosch. And I just want to say, Mo, I think you have done brilliantly, and what you presented seemed to be, to me, the most powerful presentation here today. I also have a question, which is about Antoinette's presentation and the need for continued conversation, and how do we have this conversation, what are the terms of this conversation, who participates, and who decides the framework. And so that's once again kind of half the violence of the space and what needs to be unmade before we can even begin to speak here. And you also spoke about the important learning that happens outside of the space of the classroom. And I think that Open Stellenbosch has been drawing attention to some of that. For instance, the students who were told you don't belong here because you don't speak Afrikaans, so there's lessons that are learned through violence. And so before we kind of try to claim those moments of pedagogy outside and inside of the classroom, I think we have to think about what are the thoughts inside those students' heads, and where they come from, and what's our role as academics in planting them, and how do we begin to change that. Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Heidi Thomas. I just asked to introduce myself. I'm a member of Open Stellenbosch.
Thank you, Heidi. Is there a panel member that wants to respond?
Is it Kylie? Hi, Kylie. That's unfortunate. I just have to explain. I'm in the process of creating an institute called Africa Open, which I started in the middle of last year, so I was quite delighted to see Open Stellenbosch appear on the scene, and I could see some really interesting combinations of Africa Open Stellenbosch and having concerts called Openings. And so the slip of the tongue was not really to reference Mo as from Africa, it was from Africa Open, which is more on my mind these days than Open Stellenbosch.
Thank you. I do also want to say that I've spoken to the organizers at length about this panel and what it can look like, and I think we all realize that it's a very clumsy attempt, and like all our attempts, all my attempts to have conversations like this, I think, will be clumsy, but we have to keep on trying.
Yeah, I think in terms of how do we move forward and how do we actually reclaim those spaces highly, I think that's where the partnerships come in and where those conversations need to happen. On the terms of the lived experiences, as I mentioned, of the students, we need to listen and we need to do something about it. So I really think in terms of reclaiming space, it's incredibly important. On this university campus. So I'm not saying engaging in conversations on these terms or those terms, but actually arguing for creating open spaces and making everybody feel comfortable within those spaces to voice their concerns.
Other questions? Okay.
Which person also asked a question. Anyways, I think there is a general perception that we have come with, minorities have come to the Stellenbosch University and that we need to fit ourselves in. However, the university will do something to assist with that regard, but we need to put something in. And as a result, I text to your version of the Stellenbosch viewers that we say, sadly, even by the students, which would assume that the younger ones would be more open and understanding. And it's a very sad thing that when you came to Stellenbosch, you knew as an African university, so for English, why did you go to university? And that is an ongoing thing. It's almost like an acceptable norm around the university, and it's a very strong perception. Because we do not have any African university. In this so far as the university is concerned, we do not have it. And so Stellenbosch is not an African university, and that should not be treated as one. It is a public institution of higher learning in South Africa, and that is why we are here. We are here because it's a public institution of higher learning in South Africa, and not because it is an African university. We're not here to pay Africaners invitation. No, we're not. We are here so far as our constitutional right is concerned, and thus we're supposed to be treated equally as the Africans are because we have the same right. And therefore, if Stellenbosch is a public institution of higher learning, that suggests that it remains a public matter because it's a public institution of higher learning. I mean, we had in the past your Forte University during the time of Mandela. We had your Bush University at the time it was Bush College for Pilots. And that was then, and that was as far as the area is concerned, which Stellenbosch was an African university at the time. It's no longer in. And I think unless we get to understand that as point A, that we are not an African university, we're in a public institution of higher learning, then we are ready to go forward. When this also called inclusivity, we will let go of it because nobody is to be included. We already are here. And now if we already are here, we're here because we're public members. And if you're a public member in a public institution of higher learning, then the space is supposed to be very to be given to all people. And therefore, I don't understand the ideology behind having Afrikaans as the medium of instruction and trying to feature other languages, even to a level where Afrikaans is. I don't get that. Why are we stuck with Afrikaans? Why is that we have this Afrikaans and then other languages? Why is that the case? Why is that we have one language that needs to be supreme other official languages? Now, if my classmate can study in his native, which is Afrikaans, why then am I type them or privilege to study my own native? I've got mine too. So now if my classmate can study in his native, I should be allowed the same privilege. And another person so and the university cannot afford it. We cannot have course as we cannot have that. And if we cannot have that, then it means we need to have a common ground. And the common ground is in English. If I have to translate, I'm hearing in English, I translate to Hausa to understand, and I have to translate back to give to the lecturer. Same can the African student do the same. They can hear in English, translate to Afrikaans to understand, translate back to the lecturer to understand. Then why do they even standard? I think it's only fair. So I really don't get the concept of having Afrikaans to accommodate other languages. Why is that the case in democracy? Why do we have this Afrikaans to accommodate other languages? Why are we stuck with Afrikaans?
Thank you. There's someone on the response to that.
Yeah, I would just add to that. And I want to remind people that we are a little less than 2 weeks away from June 16. And, you know, what was happening in 1976 was mainly a mobilization around Black students who felt that the imposition of Afrikaans I struggle to understand why 21 years after democracy, we are having to fight the same battles that our parents fought in 1976. What does Stellenbosch University do on June 16? And what are students told on June 16? What is there to commemorate on June 16 in this place? I think that's a question we really need to ask ourselves quite earnestly. What are we doing?
Responses?
Yes, I fully agree, and I think it's important that we look at the historical context. That explains why the situation is as it is. But we need not be continuously the victims and the captors of the history. We can change things. So the first need is to make sure what has happened, why did we arrive at this point, and understand the social and ideological forces that has made a certain situation into what it is. And it is full of identity issues while we are saying that we are doing education. And that's why my argument is to look into both of these aspects of the use of language and then focus on the educational one as the main task of the university. And in that sense, we could start on a new basis by using the lingua franca, English, or maybe in the future Mandarin, or Prosa, or what it may be, and work with that, and then also at the same time use this history of knowledge in terms of multilingualism, translation, Afrikaans, as a language that has developed much higher than any of the other languages in South Africa, and use that for the benefit of all the languages in South Africa. I think in that sense we can create a very specific community and new initiative at this university that will amaze the rest of the country and of this continent. And we just need to see the opportunity. But as long as we resist by giving priority to Afrikaans, I think this is not going to work. So when we think very clearly about where we come from and what we actually are doing and what the needs are of most of our students and how we can facilitate that learning and how languages can be tools to achieve that learning, then I think that combination can be an immense winner and an example for other universities.
More questions? Comments?
Being captive in the system and changing. My question is about the language policy and how much of that and the issues around the language policy are just a symptom of an institution that is basically a pseudo-public institution. It's a public institution of higher learning that is really not accountable to the public. I mean, I don't feel like I have much of a say, even as a member of the Stellenbosch in what happens with the language policy of the construction as an institution that is accountable for its private interests, and how much of this and all of the discussions are just symptomatic of an institution that caters for private interests and is not monopolized.
Thank you. I know there's another question here, but there's someone who wants to speak to the question of the ownership of the university and who it belongs to, really.
It's just to do with that report that Mo referenced about the money that's been allocated to promote ISICOSA and academic scholarship in ISICOSA. That is also to promote academic scholarship in Upper France, and it's being funded by the Jan Marais Nationale Fonds. And the head of that is a man called Andreas van Beek. I don't know if he's here because I don't know what he looks like. But he used to be the rector of this university. Some people who've been here for a long time probably know about this. He resigned actually because he was also at the same time the incoming chairperson for the Broederhoed, and that guy still is the director of National National Funds. And so I think that question of the role of by capital and also of the Broederhoed is an important question to raise and in relation to this question for the university and its status as a public institution.
Okay, I want to get to that question, but if you are speaking to this issue,
Hi. Chris Beek has actually resigned as chair of MRA. He's retiring from that. I think there needs to be some clarity regarding MRA. That the funding, which is over $1 billion right now, gives a lot of money to some disadvantaged schools in this town. I don't think people realize that. It supports a lot of structured institutions in this town, which do not just go to white people. I think we need to be very clear about that. Obviously, discussions can come from where the money comes from, was the land funds and so on. I mean, especially the Western Cape, it's a complicated debate that I'm not involved with. But he did do a lot of good. And the way that money is invested, the way that money is now, I think it's like 1.7 billion now. It's doing a lot of good and it will continue to do good. We can do better. Thank you.
thank you. Can we move to the question over here?
Thank you. I would like to also say something about Jan Marais, because I would like to say something on behalf of people from Pietersburg, where I come from. I think many of us regard this as a violent space simply because we're not bilingual. And we really can't do this. So we have to sit and listen because we're not able to do this kind of discussion in English. We should also have a friendly space for those people, I think. But I would like to say something about the fact that English-speaking academics, where are they? Where are the European or African or the other academics? I'm not an academic myself, I'm a support person, but in the past 10 years, I think, all advertisements going out for the appointment of academics were actually published in English as well. They were published in the public domain. So when I tried to apply for this job, I actually was aware that I won't get the job if any Black or English-speaking or African or whatever kind of academic would go for this job. So I realized that I won't get it unless there's nobody else. The reason I'm saying this is, the whole thing about transformation, I think most of us really agree, this university desperately needs to transform. We're waiting for these guys, we're actually waiting for them to get into positions where they can say something, where they can make a difference, where they can
and help transform. Those of us working hard for transformation, we are our own here. We're trying very hard. We're not very often supported. Thank you.
Responses from the panel?
Just about the university efforts. This university is the only university in the country which requires writing and reading competencies in Afrikaans for staff. Okay. So you're not going to attract black African lecturers or support staff. That's the response to that.
Okay.
As far as my experience goes, and I've done quite a lot of job adverts, that is not a requirement. It's not allowed to make that a requirement. In any job advert in the support services that I'm in, no job advert can have that requirement in terms of language.
That requires reading and writing skills in Afrikaans. Now that excludes black Africans.
But then we'll have to have a look at that, because all the ads I've been doing, spoken to human resources, and they said it cannot be a prerequisition in terms of English or Afrikaans. You've got to be fluent in both. Any more comments on this specific issue?
Sorry, I'm just wondering about how it works in practice, because it might not be written in the ad that it's a requirement, but I mean, there's a reproduction happening, so what
Any comments on that?
I don't think I'm directly commenting on that. I just wanted to make the starting work of Afrikaans people doing their work. And what I mean by that is by being in uncomfortable spaces and switching the language that is in your brain and thinking consciously about the comfortable spaces and then doing the work that we so often want other speakers or people that represent the other space. We expect other people to do the work. And I think there's a lot of Afrikaans speaking staff students, and I want to acknowledge that it's sometimes difficult, especially in a space where you consider yourself to be in an oppressive or in a dominant position. And I just want to encourage people to embrace that. And I love some of the perspectives from the panel that encourages that. And in that sense, I like demanding that there is also Afrikaans white panelists. Because we have to model important work and new ways of being Afrikaans and white in a democratic space. And so in that sense, I really appreciate that. I think there's more people that need to come to the world.
Thank you. I think I'm going to give panel members a chance to say something if they want in conclusion, but I think we have to bring the discussion to a close after that. The father has said enough.
Yeah, I'll just say one last thing. And it has to do with, and again, I mean, I understand that the language policy is being presented as rigidly as it is right now in favor of Afrikaans because of multilingualism, because of language diversity. But I also think that we haven't done enough to really understand the teleological underpinnings of that language policy, the real purpose behind the language policy. What are some of, in other words, if the desire is to encourage language diversity in a space where Afrikaans is historically has been historically privileged and actually continues to be privileged. If the desire is to to foster an environment of language diversity. At what point do we move from accepting that simply as a desire to interrogating that desire? And this is where I advocate the teleological underpinnings of the language policy. What is it that the language policy is wanting to do? If it is multilingualism, then have we done the necessary work to understand what we mean by and what multilingualism would look like in a post-context of Africa? And quite frankly, I don't think that that is the case. And this is, again, evidence. I mean, this is one instantiation of this is, again, this cause of fun that has emerged. Yesterday, speaking on Power FM, which is a German-based radio station, caters to largely black middle class, the Vice Chancellor was presenting this new fund for Xhosa as a language, with the development of Xhosa as a language. And you have to ask yourself whether or not, you know, this comes off as a genuine approach to multilingualism and language diversity, or if in fact we're deluding ourselves into believing that the more signs we have in Xhosa, the more brown people we have walking around, we can delude ourselves into believing that we are becoming a transformed university. And I was speaking to someone earlier this week, and there was a very interesting something that really stayed with me. And she was speaking about the barometer of success, and mentioned that, you see, when people who've been at the university since the 80s look at it right now, they say, oh wow, this is a very transformed university. This is a very, you know, this good work being done here. But when you're talking to me as a black person who is not born after apartheid, but grew up after apartheid, I don't have that 70s, 80s thing as a frame of reference. And so this space for me does not reflect, in fact, any modicum of transformation. And so, you know, this is an important thing to, you know, to understand with people that are saying, yes, but we're trying, yes, but we're doing very well, you know, it's just a matter of structural modifications to the implementation of the language policy. It isn't. It's far deeper than that. And we're using very different yardsticks and measurements of what that is. The one is using the past as a way of justifying the present, and from the perspective of young people, we're using the future as an aspirational understanding of what transformation ought to look like.
Okay. Yeah, I've been sitting here and listening, and I heard somebody say that multilingualism should start on a clean slate. And I think we should be careful that we don't see multilingualism as a problem, but rather as a resource. A couple of years ago, we had an education system where we introduced ODE, and we threw away what we had, and now we are sitting with a problem in our education system. Then that does not mean that I don't support the initiatives of Open Stellenbosch. I think that as somebody who's been working in Stellenbosch for 14 years now, and somebody who has the 70s and 80s as a frame of reference, and I just want to say also, in the school where I taught, in 1976, when the first, just started to teach, and when the first rock stone was thrown, it was not as a result of language. So this is about much more than language. In the Cape, it was not about language in our schools. However, I think that in Stellenbosch, we do miss opportunities for skill enhancement. 2 years ago, we had restructuring, and as a member of Stellenbosch University staff, I was very, very concerned that in our environment there were 21 new posts. And of those posts, 14 were already filled with white people. But that 7 extra posts were also then filled with white people. And I thought that if you are managing an environment, if you are strategic, then you should be noticing such things. And then you should do your best. So I'm sorry, Italy, my colleague here, that this is also part of the issue here. That it's difficult for you to stand and contradict what people say. But there were people, there are people out there. I'm sure you don't need rocket science to manage the residences at Stellenbosch University. So yes, in some instances there are not those people. But in 2013, when we had this restructuring in our environment, I'm sure there were people. But the fact that 21 of those posts were filled with white people, that was of concern to a lot of the black staff at Stellenbosch University. And the posts that were subsequently filled was because somebody resigned, so there was another person. So I think that, yes, it is a very complex issue, but we should be careful that we don't make multilingualism a scapegoat, that we should see multilingualism as a resource. So I would like more clarity about that clean slate.
Okay, we're actually getting to the end of our discussion, so I'm going to give Kes and brief comments, please.
Okay. In terms of the clean slate, I think I said we're not starting from a clean slate. That was my point. And I think what we're trying to do with multilingualism, what I also heard from the audience is there's lots of, sorry. Oh, okay. Because I think we need to hear all the voices, the Afrikaans voices, the English voices. I heard Monica as well speaking about that as well. So it's not about just one dominant discourse or just hearing one voice, but multiple voices. And that's why I want to return to the point that I started with in saying we're not an Afrikaans university, we're not an English university, we're a South African multilingual university. And that's the ideal. And I acknowledge that it is a process and it's a painful process. And I'm acknowledging that it's not just going to happen overnight. But I have to believe that if we take hands and we work together, we continue these conversations, that we'll achieve that ideal that we're all moving towards.
Thank you. I've got hearing problems, but apart from that, my wife says I also cannot listen very well. So I'm going to just talk. First of all, I really thought that saying that we need to look at English as the main language of instruction is going to lead to a violent reaction here, but it seems it hasn't. It may still come. But I think this is really something to consider for the future, and we better be proactive than react after things have gone wrong. The second point that I emphasized was that we can use multilingualism and all the expertise around that Stellenbosch has collected over such a long period of time to the benefit of Afrikaans and African languages. And I think it's something to celebrate and something that can be following the first focus on openness and access. And I think that the Jan Marais Fund is also available for that purpose. And then lastly, on the process, I think it is clear that Open Stellenbosch has started a conversation through the manifesto and its activism, and this was a reaction to that, and I think we need much more of that sort of dynamic and to link that to the experts and the academics, the students, and everybody on campus. So I think we are going into a very interesting period quite soon.
Okay, I think I'm going to end the conversation here. It's clear, I think everyone agrees that language is a very complex issue, but it's saturated with other issues such as issues of identity, history, culture, race. And that language can be a medium, it can be a facilitator, but I think it's been very powerful out also it can become an alibi. And that we have to be very careful that we don't use the complexity of the issue as an excuse not to transform, and I think that point has been made by almost everyone. Thank you very much. I again want to say thank you to the organizers. I think this is a fantastic opportunity, and I don't think in my years at Stellenbosch I've had a real academic discussion about language at Stellenbosch. So I think this can be only good, and I hope we have many similar discussions. So thank you, Piers and Stephen, for organizing.